This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hello and welcome to Daughterhood, the podcast. I am your host, Rosanne Corcoran, Daughterhood Circle Leader and Primary Caregiver. Daughterhood is the creation of Ann Tumlinson, who has worked on the front lines in the healthcare field for many years and has seen the multitude of challenges caregivers face. Our mission is to support and build confidence in women who are managing their parents' care. Daughterhood is what happens when we put our lives on hold to take care of our parents. We recognize this care is too much for one person to handle alone. We want to help you see your efforts are not only good enough, they are actually heroic. Our podcast goal is to bring you some insight into navigating the healthcare system, provide resources for you as a caregiver as well as for you as a person, and help you know that you don't have to endure this on your own. Join me in Daughterhood. David Kessler is one of the world's foremost experts on grief and loss. His experience with thousands of people on the edge of life and death has taught him the secrets to living a happy and fulfilled life, even after life's tragedies. He is the author of 6 books, including his latest bestseller, Finding Meaning: The 6th Stage of Grief. David also co-authored On Grief and Grieving with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, which updated her 5 stages of grief to include the grieving process. David's journey into grief and trauma work began after witnessing a mass shooting as a child while his mother was dying. He has since taught professionals in various fields, including healthcare and law enforcement, about the end-of-life trauma and grief. Despite his expertise, the sudden death of his 21-year-old son profoundly impacted him, leading to his latest book, Finding Meaning. In this episode, we talk about the extra layer of grief for caregivers, giving ourselves the opportunity to move through grief, what that looks like, how our grief stories affect us, and how to find yourself again. I hope you enjoy our conversation. One of the challenges with caregiving is we become entwined with our care partners. We're doing so much for them every day, and when they die, we have not only the grief over their loss, but the grief over our relationship with them and our time, our purpose, all of that. How can we grieve them and find our way back to ourselves?
Well, I think it's important to realize there's not only the grief over them, there's the grief over the role of caregiving.
Yes.
That role was a struggle, meaningful, purposeful, challenging, hard. It was everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't let go of that easily.
No.
And I don't think we realized sort of how it sucked us in until all of a sudden when it's gone.
Right.
So it is a whole nother form of attachment that we ended up having to this person. And so there's the loss of them and there's the loss of it.
Yep. And we already know as a society, caregivers aren't looked at like we do a whole lot because we're caring for our people. Like, how hard is that? And it's extremely hard. And it's the same thing with grievers, right? It's the same. And it's the same thing on the flip side when they're gone, then people are like, oh, well, you must be happy you have your life back.
Right. And that's a form of bright siding.
Yes.
That it's no different than you should be happy. You've got your life back. At least they died and now you're free and all that
Right.
stuff. And, I can remember one gentleman shared with me, he went to the grocery store and he felt so lost and untethered that he could stay there. He didn't have to rush. And his mind was like, well, being able to not have to rush back or keep my phone ready should be a good thing. And yet he just felt adrift.
Yeah. And it's constant. And, there are times it could be decades that you're carrying.
Yes.
And it's gone. And it's hard to differentiate just how much you're feeling all of this loss. And it's hard to try to parse through what's the grief over your relationship, what's the PTSD and the trauma that you're carrying. It's hard to parse all of that out in that new space.
And let's name another loss.
Yeah.
There was probably the gradual loss of yourself.
Absolutely.
Because you, in the highest form, put yourself aside for another.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you have the road back of trying to find you. And even you didn't realize it was a loss.
Yeah. And how do you look at that in that way, David? How do you go about trying to find yourself again?
Well, I think it's to recognize that all these losses have to be grieved, not to bright side yourself, because it's easy to go, I should be happy, I am free, I am, and we can do that to ourselves. And to realize this takes time. And finding yourself, like you have said, for some people, it may have been 6 months of caregiving, but for others, it may have been 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you forgot what it was like to be focused on you. So it is a road back to figure out, with our loved ones, we're like, oh, this is exactly how they like their coffee. This is how that, and you're like, well, wait a minute. What do I like?
Mm-hmm.
Does it matter to me?
Right.
And so you do have to really be patient and compassionate with yourself. And, people often will say, well, how do I figure out what I like again? And I go, you just try things. And sometimes you find out what you like by realizing what you don't like. Yeah, no, I didn't care for that. That wasn't it.
Right.
And I think a mistake our mind makes is as we're trying to find ourselves again, our mind can go, all right, well, I don't like that. I don't like that. There's no one inside. And it's like, no, you just found 2 things you didn't like. You got to keep poking around and seeing the things you do like, but don't give up on yourself. And to realize, if your loved one's life was so precious, so is yours. So is yours.
Yeah. We forget that sometimes.
Yeah.
We forget that we're just as important in the equation as they are.
Correct. And if you can even go so far as like, can I reward myself? Can I be kind to myself for all that I did? Like, it isn't a time of deprivation. It's a time to be extra kind.
It's very hard to look, and I hear this from caregivers a lot, and I know I felt this way. It's hard to look at that like, okay, well, I did that. This is what I did, and this is what I did for this amount of time. And it's hard to step back and say, you know what? I actually kept this person going. I actually did this. And it's almost to give ourselves credit. And that's not the strong point because we're always out. Everything we're doing is outward facing. We don't have that opportunity to go inward. And I think in grief, you really have to go inward.
And so many people will say something just like you said that, oh my gosh, I should have caught that last thing, or we should have seen that coming because they needed more time. And I'll say, what if they actually got a lot of extra time because you were there? What if you already gave them so much extra time that you're not giving yourself credit for?
That's a great way to look at it. And I think I can speak for myself. For me, 20 more years with my mother wouldn't have been enough.
Right.
So it's There's never going to be that, okay,
No,
I was ready. All right, you can
no,
go.
I'm with people all the time who their parent dies at 100 and it wasn't enough.
Right, right. There's a lot of shame that goes with grief also. And there's a sentence in the book where someone asked you how long they would grieve, and you said, I don't know, how long is your person going to be dead? And I thought that was so profound, David, because it's like, yes, how how do we measure this? And we can't measure it.
Right. It's so true. It's so true. And I put a lot of exercises in the workbook around shame, just to sort of understand that.
Yes. This week workbook is, I mean, David, you get into the nitty-gritty here. And your questions are very measured and very deep.
And we don't realize, I mean, I was so amazed that there's just things we think there's either acceptance or not acceptance.
Exactly.
We don't know that there's parts we haven't accepted. What does acceptance mean? I mean, just sort of teasing those things out. And I also put light checklists in there. I didn't want everyone to think, oh my gosh, if I do this workbook, I've got to answer these hard questions. No, you can go in 2 minutes, do a checklist. But I do want to say it's interesting. Someone said to me, I bought the workbook, I put it on the shelf. I'm not quite ready for it.
Mhm.
And I said, tell me more about that. And they said, well, I'm not quite ready to go into the pain. And I said to them, oh, dear one, I wish you could put the pain on the shelf with the workbook. You put the workbook on the shelf, but not the pain. The pain is in you.
Yeah.
The workbook is how to move the pain out of you, to get it moving.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, if you don't mind. I think that is the big fear. I don't want to feel this again. I don't want to feel that level. I don't know. You hear people say, I can't talk about it. I'm going to start crying and I'm never going to stop.
I tell people I've been with thousands of people, everyone stops crying eventually. But if you have 1,000 tears to cry, it doesn't serve you to stop at 200. So cry. So cry. Well, it upsets people around me. Okay. And your job isn't to make yourself digestible for others. Your job is to feel what you're feeling.
And find other people that you can be comfortable around.
Right, right. And that's why we do grief groups. We've been getting together in groups since practically the beginning of time because grief is a weird thing. The family and friends who got you and understood you suddenly don't get your grief. And it's a moment where family and friends can feel like strangers, and strangers that you meet in a grief group can feel like family and friends. So it's really remarkable in that way. And we find ourselves in each other's stories. And that's why I love. And, we have in my online group, Tender Hearts, we have over 26 groups for people who have had a loss, but we've also a death of a person, but we've also opened it up now to people who have anticipatory grief, that they're in the midst of caregiving and they see things are winding down and they need to get support.
Yeah, it's very important. And
People forget about that anticipatory grief.
they always do. And there's such a line of grief that runs through caregiving. And it's the part that makes everything really heavy and nobody talks about it. So as you're caregiving, you're thinking, why do I feel this way? It's the anticipatory grief. And it's just as deep as regular grief. And I say regular in quotes.
I also would like to talk about for a moment when we talk about caregiving, our loved ones sometimes get to the point where we cannot handle them. And they do have to sometimes go into nursing homes or assisted living and things like that. And I want to break that down a little bit for people, that guilt.
Yes.
There was a time 100 years ago that you and your whole family, your whole extended family lived in the same house. And if you went to work, It doesn't matter. Your aunts were there, your brothers were there. Caregiving was not a problem. And if you all didn't live at the same house, they were across the street or next door, your other family members. And back in those days, if someone did not care for their family, you were a bad family member, that you had the resources and didn't do it.
Mhm.
And that belief of you're bad if you have to get help caught on back then and is still with us. And now we've moved into a life where it's often just us caring for our loved one. There's not family members in the house. They don't live next door. And the burden is on us, and we're exhausted. And the truth is, the most loving thing sometimes is to get help
Mhm.
and to have them cared for by people who aren't exhausted. And you get to go and just be the daughter, just be the son, just be the spouse. So I want to try to take the shame out of that 100-year-old judgment that doesn't really apply in our modern world. I mean, you can't hold down a job and be a caregiver. And so people are like, but I feel so bad getting help for them. And I try to tell them it's okay. It actually, many times, is the most loving, caring thing to do.
Yes. I'm so glad that you said that. Yes. There's enough guilt and grief to go around, and you don't need to add that onto yourself. Yep. You talk a lot about our grief stories also, that they can hold a lot of power over us. And you have multiple exercises in the book about them, witnessing it from different perspectives and even questioning our story. Can you explain the importance of testing our story of our own grief?
Yeah. So here's the thing, we have events that happen in our life. Our loved one died. That's the event. We then make up stories around the event. Your mother could be 105, and your story is it was too soon. She died before her time. You can have any story, a good death, a bad death. It's my fault. I'm to blame. I mean, one person I know swears to you that she brought her mother tortilla soup in the hospice 3 days before she died, and that's what killed her mother.
Mhm.
I also talk about this concept of confabulation.
Yes.
Confabulation is a term we often hear around children. The children sort of believe their stories, like, no, I didn't break the vase. And you're like, I saw you. I know it was an accident, but I saw you. And kids are like, nope, it wasn't me. Well, that goes on with us around our stories. We get committed to our stories of blame and judgment. And so, you know, death is this thing that's so out of our control. And our mind wants to find control. And I always tell people our mind would always rather be guilty than feel helpless. So we'd rather think the soup did it, me asking for pain management, me putting dad in the nursing home did it. We want to find that one thing that did it, because if we can find what did it, we cannot do it again. And that way we're safe from death ever happening. But the truth is, that isn't what did it. Their lives were winding down.
Mhm.
And you've just got a story of false control. So when we talk about questioning it, we're really asking, is it true that everyone who has tortilla soup dies? Is that true? Because I had it the other day and I didn't die. Is it true if we ask for pain management for our loved ones, they die? Oh, yes, the morphine kills. I'll go, well, wait a minute. I broke my arm and ribs. They gave me morphine. I didn't die. They give morphine in the orthopedic unit. They don't die. They give morphine in OB when women are having babies and they don't die. Wait a minute. So morphine, that's not the reason. But wait, you said your loved one was in the hospice. Why were they in the hospice? Oh, they had advanced aggressive cancer? Well, that's why they died, not the pain management, not the morphine. So, but our mind wants to find it. And I also talk about the workbook, something called proximal causation. Our mind wants to believe what happened before, right before the death, caused it. Oh my gosh, I forgot to give them their aspirin. No, they didn't die because they forgot their aspirin. I take aspirin, I forget it all the time. I don't die.
Right.
It's like, but our mind wants to find those things. So sometimes we need to question it. Now, I have to tell you, I'm such a group lover.
Mhm.
When I do one on one work, someone can go, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but, and just argue the point. But there's something about in a group when you see someone who's beating themselves up the same way you're beating yourself up, and you go, that's ridiculous that they think that's what, oh, but wait, I think the same thing.
Yep.
Oh, gosh, I'm doing that to me also.
It's so true. We see it all the time in our groups, and it's the beauty of being around other people who are in the same situation. And it's much like, you wouldn't say that to your friend, but you're saying it to yourself.
Nonstop.
Yeah, nonstop.
In a very cruel way. We have the idea that our mind would be so kind, and it's actually not.
Mhm.
The mind's protective and predictive, and it wants to make sure another bad thing doesn't happen to you. So it thinks if you find that cause, even if it's you can protect yourself.
Makes perfect sense. One of the other struggles is the disloyalty that we feel when we start to either have fun or make plans, even, or even when we have to make decisions, which we have to do a lot of. How do we feel? How do we deal with those feelings of being disloyal by doing those things?
When we were doing from the book, the disloyalty checklist, that laughing again feels wrong. And, I often share how, once again, decades ago, the only people that wore black were those who were in mourning. And I say mourning is what we do on the outside, grief is what's inside. And at a year, your clergy often said to you, you can still wear black, but you now have permission to take it off. You now have permission to begin living again. We don't know when the moment is that we can live again. We don't know when we can do that again. And so that's so confusing to us to find when is it okay? And is living again really being disloyal?
Right.
And one other thing I want to say that I see happening a lot with caregivers. I see this more than I wish I did, but it happens a lot. Someone's been caregiving for 6 years, and then they finally can have their own life and find their own life. And they say, my aunt is doing poorly. She might need some help. And I'll go, does your aunt also have kids? Oh, yeah, she's got 4 kids. So wait a minute, you cared for your mom. You're thinking of diving in and caring for aunt? Really think about that, because maybe every person who's ill isn't yours to care for. And be careful not to unknowingly sort of try to get purpose by outsourcing it to one more person to care for. I always say to people, there is someone else you have to care for now. You. You let their kids take care of them. You be the caregiver of you now.
Yes.
Well, but I'm around. They all know I'm not working. You're just enabling them not to have to sacrifice
Hmm.
or do anything because you're going to make it so convenient.
Yeah.
Don't do that to yourself.
You become a serial caregiver. Yeah. So interesting. And do you think it's to stave off the feelings of loss and the feelings of loss, both of the person and the routine, the caregiving?
And we gravitate towards what's familiar,
Yeah.
even if it's not good for us. Like, wait, I could dive in and care for your mother. Like, I know how to organize the room. I know how to do everything. I know how to da da da. Like, that's my talent at this point. How to care for me? I'm not familiar with that job.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that is the job we have to get familiar with, is caring for ourselves.
Yeah. And how do you tap into that? In those early, that first year is a blur half the time, even the first 18 months sometimes. How do you try, or when do you start trying to tap back into you?
As soon as you can.
Okay.
As soon as you can. You know, it is a really hard thing to just, I say sometimes to people, I know you may not be ready to take this in, but I'm just planting a seed.
Hmm.
It is so tragic that their story has ended, but yours has not. And just little by little, find yourself a new story. And it's just things like take yourself to a restaurant. Oh, that's silly. I know you can make something at home, but did you ever bring, oh yes, we had special occasions. I would bring them out to a restaurant. It was hard, but we would do it. Well, can you bring you out to a restaurant? All right, well, I'm going to go to the restaurant we always went to. Okay, start there. Do reminiscing there. Do your grief there. And then at some point, I want you to take yourself to a new restaurant.
Hmm.
Oh, yeah, there was one restaurant my wife was curious about. No, no, no. Like, pick a new restaurant just for you that had like nothing to do with them. They didn't know about it. Maybe it's brand new. Begin to just, I tell people you've had so much subtraction. Find some addition. And when I say addition, people go, what? I'm supposed to get a puppy? No, you don't have to start with a puppy,
Right.
but take a walk in a different park. Go to a different movie theater. Go to a different mall. Go to a different restaurant. Just begin adding little things.
I love that. And that actually ties into you call them activators, people call them triggers.
Right?
When you say when something activates us like that, it's asking for attention from us. How do you deal with, we used to always go to this restaurant, now I can't drive by it, or this was my father's favorite soda and I can't pick it up anymore. Anything like that. How do you deal with those?
Yeah. Look, the work, a friend of mine is Dr. Edith Eger, and she talks about turning your traumatic wound into your cherished wound. And so that is about that place is traumatic. And it's okay early on to drive a mile out of the way to not pass that hospital.
Hmm.
And at some point, you think, oh, as long as I avoid that hospital, I'll avoid the pain. At some point, I want you to consider gently, lovingly walking into that pain. Whether you just go, I think it's in the hospital, but the pain's actually in me. Because the hospital's reminding you of a pain. I could drive by that same hospital. It would have no pain for me. It's not like it's a painful place. It reminds you of pain that's in you. So, of course, drive around for a while. And then at some point, gently sit with what's that feeling I get when I'm near that hospital? For some people, it might be to gently go there, park one evening and just sit and remember and cry and feel. They're just feelings asking to be felt.
Hmm.
They're not your enemy. They're just feelings wanting to be felt.
No, I love that.
And we live in a world now that wants to get rid of all the triggers on the outside. And it's like, you know what? I promise you, if you don't drive by that hospital ever again, something else is going to get you because that pain inside will need to get projected onto something else besides the hospital.
Yes.
All of a sudden, you're like, there's those commercials on TV. Something's going to activate you, trigger you.
Absolutely. And it's you can't run away from it. You can try, but
And that's okay if you need to for a while.
Yep.
But here's the thing, what we run from pursues us. What we face transforms us. At some point, we want to allow the transformation.
I love that, David. My goodness. You talk about the hero's journey in the book and the grief journey. And I love that because again, we're set up to think, what's the hero's journey? And then you come out on top. And you really separated it out. And why did you take that approach in the book?
Well, it goes a little bit back to where we started that, we tell our stories differently.
Mm-hmm.
My mother died, and when I was young, in a horrible situation, she died alone. There was a shooting, and it was so traumatic. And in my childhood, in my teenage years, I wanted to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, I would tell my story like, oh, yeah, no big deal. Stuff happens to everyone. Yeah, I had a little shooting and mom died in my childhood, but everyone's got something. And people were like, no, we don't have that. So that telling my story didn't work that well. Then, as I got into my early 20s and I really saw the impact of that trauma and grief, I felt victimized. And I told that story as a victim. And then, years later, as I did my own work, I went from telling the story as a victim to a victor.
Mm-hmm.
And the hero's journey, most of us, whether we know it or not, know the hero's journey. It's Lord of the Rings, it's the Hunger Games, it's Star Wars, it's probably any movie you love.
Yep.
And what we've all seen is someone is going through their everyday life. I mean, think of Luke Skywalker in Star Wars going through their everyday life, and his parents are killed.
Mm-hmm.
We are thrown into the dark world. That's the grief. We're thrown into the dark world. And after we're thrown into the dark world, we have the enemies, the allies, people try to help us. We resist it. I'm never going to heal from this. I can't get better. Healing's a bad word. I'll never live again. Life is over. We resist it. And we continue through those dark worlds. And eventually, we begin to come out back to where we started, still us. Our loved ones are still dead. Everything has changed, including us. And we realize we're the hero of this journey. We're the one who survived and made it. I often tell people, you've survived 100% of your worst days.
Yes.
You've survived 100% of your worst days. I mean, someone will go, oh my gosh, I'm not going to live through the anniversary that's coming up. I'm like, oh my gosh, you lived through their death. If you can live through their death, there's nothing you can't live through now. I mean, that's the worst.
Mhm.
That's the worst.
Yep. Very true. Well, and that comes back to the fear of acceptance, I think, where people are afraid if they accept this and start to move forward, it means they're forgetting them or they're over it. And how do you see acceptance in grief?
Well, I think we make the mistake of thinking there's one acceptance. Like there's a big acceptance.
Right.
It was in the top drawer. I looked everywhere. I didn't find it there.
Right.
Who knew it was there? It's not. There's a little acceptance when they get sick. There's a little more acceptance we have to find when they die. There's a little more acceptance we have to find to plan the funeral. There's a little more acceptance to go to the funeral. There's a little more acceptance if we can't have a funeral. When it goes on and on, there's a million little acceptances. So it's not just this one moment. And obviously, Kubler-Ross and I used to talk about people feel like, acceptance is the end.
Right.
And there isn't an end. Our goal in grief is to remember with more love than pain. That's the goal. That's the goal, more love than pain, but in our own way and in our own time.
You've been doing this a really long time. And what do you tell people when it comes to that point of pain of, is there a time when it becomes you really need some professional help? Like there's a very fine line because we know there's no time limit on grief, but it's that when is it dangerous grief?
Yeah, listen, we all need different levels of support.
Right.
And I often say, start high and decrease. I mean, people do the opposite. They're like, I'm going to white knuckle this and just get through this. And, I remind people, I have a maintenance plan that I bought on my tires. If my tires hit a pothole, I'm taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
But then the most important person to me in the world dies, and I'm not going to give me any support. I don't understand this world. My tires get support, but I don't get support. I don't need to I mean,
right.
So look, some of us need grief counseling. Some of us need a grief group. Some of us need friends and family support. That can be tricky. We don't always get it.
Right.
And you have to find your place. Look, after my younger son died, oh my gosh, I'm a grief expert. I went to a grief counselor, a grief group, and it still wasn't enough.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough. So I say, give yourself support and decrease as you need.
Okay.
Go to a grief counselor, see if that helps. Go into a grief group.
Okay.
And, it is a fine line. And I think it's hard to know that line. And maybe it's not so much, do I need professional help as much as it's, do I deserve some support through this? And, some people go, well, David, easy for you to say. I mean, I can't afford therapy. Okay, your insurance might pay for it. And if not, like even my online, there's so many groups that are free. My online group is very reasonable and no one's turned away for lack of funds.
Mm-hmm.
Money doesn't have to be an excuse in this world for grief support. So get it.
Last question. You reference in your book, it's how we react to death that makes the difference between suffering and resilience and between trauma and transformation. If you could give one piece of advice to a caregiver in dealing with their grief, what would it be?
Show yourself the kindness you've shown others. Show yourself the kindness that you've shown others. Listen, begin to pay attention to how you talk to you. We usually wouldn't talk to others the way we talk to ourselves. And, I think the workbook is also a beautiful place to get support. Just to do that, just start there. Start there and get help.
A big thank you to David Kessler for being my guest today. For more information about David, his books, and his many grief groups and courses, visit grief.com. Want more Daughterhood? We are more than the podcast. We are a community that offers free, nationwide, virtual support groups we call circles. These circles allow you to connect, learn, and support one another through your caregiving journey. You can find more information at daughterhood.org, where you can register for a circle, sign up for our newsletter, and find other resources for additional support. Remember to also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Daughterhood. I hope you enjoyed our podcast today. Head over to daughterhood.org and click on the podcast section for show notes, including the full transcript and links to any resources and information from today's episode. You can find, subscribe, and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to your podcasts. You can also connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at Daughterhood. There you can discover our various circles and subscribe to our newsletter for updates. Feel free to message me on any of these sites and let me know what issues you may be facing and would like to hear more about. Or even if you just want to say hi, I'd love to hear from you. Also, a very special thank you to Susan Rowe for our theme music, the instrumental version of her beautiful song, Mama's Eyes, from her album, Lessons in Love. I hope you found what you were looking for today. Information, inspiration, or even just a little company. This is Rosanne Corcoran. I hope you'll join me next time in Daughterhood.